we'll get the maximum from this presentation. Just give you a minute to do that. And can everybody hear me? Polite nod. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks for prizing yourself away from the sun this afternoon. I've got the pleasure of introducing you to Connor Dalton. Connor is the Director of ESG, Sustainability and Health and Safety at CEF. So I'll pass you over to Connor now. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, let me just check. Can everyone hear me okay? Because this is new to me, so it's a little bit weird, so I need to get used to it. Good afternoon everyone. My name is Connor Dalton. I'm Director of ESG, Sustainability and Health and Safety at City Electrical Factors. So a bit about me before I get into the presentation. So I've spent 20 years working in sustainability. Before I joined CEF, I spent 10 years working in the supermarket sector. So I did 8 years with Aldi and a couple of years with Sainsbury's. And then prior to that, I actually started my sustainability career in the wholesale sector with Wolseley. So part of the reason I'm telling you that is it's also a bit of a disclaimer, because I am not an expert in the housing sector, okay? Where I think I can add value, and what I want to do today is just to share some best practice principles and philosophies about how to set your decarbonisation strategy and how to keep it a priority. Okay. So what I wanted to talk you through today was a bit of a journey, really. I want to take you from the start and the process that I've been through many times when trying to set a sustainability strategy and a carbon strategy. The first thing to do is to define the what and the why, the purpose, the context. Once you've done that, it's crucially to identify who. So who are your stakeholders? Who are the people you need to engage with? Once you've done that, then you need to set where are we now? What is our current performance? What is our current baseline? To then allow you to say, well, where do we want to get to, i.e. the targets, the ambition. Once you've set your targets, then it's how are you going to get there? What is the roadmap? What is the strategy? And how do you crucially keep it a business priority? Because this is one of the biggest challenges we've got in the carbon sector is you've got all these competing agendas of housing associations, businesses, and it's how do you keep this as a priority? So I'm going to share hopefully some useful tips and practical steps to help you on that journey as well. And then finally, just some key takeaways. So I wanted to start with, I think, the chart of doom that we've all probably seen loads and loads, which is all about climate change and obviously the impact that it's having. So what we can see here is this is effectively the average summer temperatures over the last, for 2023 when you compare it to the average of 1950 to 1980. So we all know what's happening here. Temperatures are increasing, greenhouse gas emissions are increasing as well. And you'll probably be aware that the United Nations, their climate change conference, COP28, there's been a conclusion where they have reached an agreement to transition away from fossil fuels, but also to try and rein in the worst effects of climate change and keep it to a 1.5 degree limit on global warming versus pre-industrial levels. Now here's the challenge. What we can see here is in 2023, it's risen by 1.17 degrees, which doesn't sound a lot, but when you compare that figure to 2022, the figure in 2022 was 0.89. So in 1 year, there has been a 31% increase in average summer temperatures globally. Yep. So the time to act is now, or 10 years ago, but we are where we are. So this starts this picture. In terms of some additional context, I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions, because this is a really important part of what I'm going to touch on today. And there'll no doubt be varying levels of knowledge and understanding in the audience. So I'm going to just talk about the fundamentals, and that's talking about the emission sources, because it lays a lot of context to what I'll come on to. So we've got really three key areas. We've got, first of all, the combustion of fossil fuels, which is effectively energy, the consumption of energy. Then we've got the industrial processes, and then finally we've got nature-based emissions, which For the housing sector are less of an impact when it comes to generation, but definitely when it comes to removing CO2 from the atmosphere, that's crucially important. So for the housing sector, my understanding is this is where a lot of the emissions will come from, in use in the properties. So heat generation and electricity generation, that's the big challenge I think when it comes to decarbonisation. So I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about the different scopes of emissions. So most of you have probably heard of scopes 1, 2 and 3. So if we look at scopes 1, that are emissions that are directly generated through your operations. So that's looking at heating, transport and refrigerants. Then if you look outside scope 1, which is the next one is scope 2, so that's effectively the energy produced off-site that you then use in your properties. So that'd be electricity and also the electricity used for things like electric vehicles. And then for yourselves, things like district heating and cooling, and purchase steam is probably less of an issue. And then finally, the big one, the one I'm going to focus on a little bit today because it's the most challenging one, is scope 3. So that's effectively everything that happens outside of your organisation, upstream and downstream. And I'm going to give you a bit of insight into the work we've done recently within CEF to try and bring it to life and show you what the approach that we've taken. So for the housing sector, again, this is my understanding. I have done some research, but a lot of the emissions will come from heating, will come from electricity, and I believe a lot of the scope 3 will come from in-life operation of the properties, and also if you've got any lease agreement, so any leased assets you've got. So I also wanted to just give you a bit of insight into some of the challenges and opportunities, because again that sets some of the context if you're going to thinking about what would be useful for yourselves. So there is 4 broad categories of the key challenges when it comes to setting a decarbonisation strategy. The first one is legislation. So when I started in the sustainability 20 years ago, there was a couple of pieces of legislation. It's now increased massively. So I believe for the housing sector, things like EPCs, etc., there's a whole raft of different legislations that are driving action. Yeah. The next one is business reputation. So this is really critical because this links to talent and recruitment. So a lot of, especially the younger generations now, are looking at, well, what type of organisations and business do I want to work for? I want to work for an organisation that's ethical, that's doing the right thing. So the business reputation piece, now that's just one stakeholder. You'll have no doubt have loads and loads of different stakeholders that will affect your business reputation, none more so than customers. And for yourselves, that's obviously the tenants and the properties. Yeah, and obviously I believe there's tenant surveys that go on all the time as well. So there's a real customer driver here, a tenant driver. And then the final one there is operational costs. Yeah, so very closely linked to carbon is energy. Yeah, so if you think about if you reduce your carbon footprint, one of the ways you will do that is by reducing your operating costs, reducing your energy consumption, reducing your fuel consumption. So financially, it's a really key driver, and it's often a way that in the past, to get engagement, especially from finance directors, that's what I focus on. So depending on who your audience is, depending on who the conversation is, you would pull on one of these levers to drive that engagement. And then you look at the challenges, and this is something I'm going to talk to you a little bit more today, is about measuring and quantifying your scopes 1, 2 and especially your scope 3. This is fundamental, but it's not easy because it's an emerging methodology, if you like, for scope 3. Another key challenge is getting funding. So I've spent 20 years in the business sector, and that's been a constant battle. How do you secure funding for decarbonisation projects? Because the funding is highly competitive within organisations. Because if I'm asking for it for sustainability measures, somebody else will be asking it for facilities, somebody will be asking for it for all these different competing agendas. So again, I'm going to give you some advice about how to do that. And then the business priorities. So one of the things I want to touch on today is how do you keep this a business priority? How do you keep it from being in vogue and then it drops off. How do you build it into the structures of your organisation? And I'll give you some advice on that. And then the final one here is choosing the right solution. So I've got I think some of the big ticket items for the housing sector in terms of decarbonisation. They're a fairly broad brush, but it needs to fit right for you and your estate. So make sure you choose the right solution. And that's often working with third parties as well who've got the right expertise. Okay, so now I wanted to talk a little bit about the what and the why in terms of the bigger picture here. So this is looking at what do we actually mean by the term net zero. So what the government have done in 2019 is, with the Climate Change Act, is we effectively baked into law that the UK will be committed to a 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 compared to 1990. So we've heard the term net zero a lot, but what effectively net zero means, it's a balance of what you emit versus what you take out. So it's looking at the greenhouse gas emissions that are generated through business, through domestic use, and then it's about how do you then offset those emissions. Now, not necessarily offsetting through investing in solar farms in faraway countries, it's more around how do you reduce your emissions through genuine energy efficiency measures and genuine reduction, because the term offsetting, that as we get closer to 2050 will become less and less of an option. So when we now start to, if you like, now move into the housing sector in terms of the context. This here is the greenhouse gas emissions in 2020, and what you can see here is around about 15% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions come from the housing stock. Yeah. So you guys will know better than me, it's one of the oldest in Europe, making it crucial for achieving the UK's net zero strategy, is getting the housing stock right, is decarbonisation of the housing stock. So now I wanted to just talk you through, hopefully, some more specific and relevant information on the housing sector. So first thing I would encourage you all to do is get hold of this document, which is the National Housing Federation's Decarbonisation, which is a guide to decarbonisation for housing associations. So there's lots and lots of great information in there. So I did some research based on this document. And you can see I've copied stuff directly from the document because it's very relevant. So this highlights some of the big issues when it comes to decarbonisation in the housing sector. So clearly a big legacy issue is around obviously the pandemic and the impact that had, and the impact it had on increasing carbon emissions, which rose by 7%. Fuel poverty is clearly a massive issue, a massive issue in the housing sector, and the stats from this tell us that nearly 1 in 5 live in fuel poverty. Yes, when we think about energy efficiency, decarbonisation, some of the things I'm going to touch on, that's important context. This is really interesting. So I've always been a big proponent when it comes to looking at decarbonisation, the power of people. The power of people are so important when it comes to driving decarbonisation, because you cannot do it alone. You need to work in partnership and collaborations with your teams across the business. And what we can see is that over 1 in 5 or over 20% of the measures that are going to deliver decarbonisation are not through technology, they're not through assets, but they're through people, through the tenants, through the people in your organisation to drive that. So this is something this will be one of the key themes that hopefully you'll take away, is the importance of relationships. Relationships internally and externally. Then we move up here, and this is a stat that says that domestic use of fossil fuels contributes to over 20% of England's carbon footprint, with social housing contributing to 10% of that. So when you look at everything, social housing has an important part to play. And then we see here nearly 3/4 of the UK's heating and hot water in buildings is met by natural gas. 10% from petrol and smaller amounts from biomass. So the mix of generation is very fossil fuel heavy. It's dirty fuel heavy. Yeah, so that's when renewables starts to come to the fore. And then here's the stat, and you always get these interesting stats about hot air balloons and football pitches, just to put things into context. So this one here talks about that in England, our homes produce more carbon emissions every year than all the cars. Now, I don't know how many cars we've got. We must have tens and tens of millions of cars in the UK. So eliminating emissions from all the housing associations would be the equivalent of taking 1.8 million cars off the road. And then it gives you a couple of cities there. Nice coincidence that we're in Manchester. So that's a little bit of context to the defining the what and the why. Now, I know this seems like quite a lot of context, but it's really, really important, guys, to get the buy-in, to drive the engagement, to drive change. A lot of this is about lobbying, a lot of this is about building relationships, and a lot of this is about using this type of information to really zoom out and look at what are the big macro factors that are contributing to this. This is a really important one as well, and this is about your stakeholders. So I've got a little bit of a map here that I actually used as part of when I was having my job interview with CEF, and it's about how do you identify your stakeholders. So I'll just chat through the chart first of all. So what you have here is a fairly basic sort of prioritisation matrix. You'll use this for lots of other things, I'm sure, but this tells you how influential are the stakeholder. On this axis, I always get confused as the X or the Y axis. I think that's the Y axis. Then you've got the X axis across here is the interest of the stakeholders. How engaged are they? What you'll have is the first thing you should be doing before you pretty much do anything is identify who is going to help contribute and deliver decarbonisation, because it cannot be one person, it cannot be you if you're responsible for that in the business. Just making a list of all the different stakeholders, and just keep in mind that the stakeholders will change as you go through the journey. Yeah, some will be important at the start to get that wheel turning, and then once you've got that momentum, we'll be about using other ones. Then what you want to do is analyse your different stakeholders. So you get a list of 10 stakeholders. What does each stakeholder bring to the table? Do they bring the money? Yeah. If you're looking at it from a hard commercial. Do they bring the softer skills, the engagement? Do they bring the leadership? Do they bring the credibility, the reputation? And I've got some stakeholders in a second who I think will be relevant for you. And that also means you can manage your resources, because I've worked in and led sustainability teams for the last 20 years, and I've worked in some huge organisations, but the teams that I've worked in or led have always been quite small when you look at comparison to the rest of the organisation. I worked in Sainsbury's, 150,000 people, and there was about 10 of us in the team. Aldi, 50,000 people, and there was even less. And I led a team of 8 or 9. So it's really important to get that, to drive that engagement. So this will help you do this, or a version of this. It doesn't take long, but it's really important because it just makes you focus your attention on, right, who do I need to spend the time with? It's like, where do you deploy your investment? Yeah, you assess, you prioritise, same with stakeholders. And then once you've mapped it out, you'll be able to understand this, as I say, where you place that. And the higher the influence, then the more engagement, the more communication you'll need with them. So, in my experience, again, this is in the supermarket and wholesale sector, but I think some of it's relevant, is, for me, the stakeholders who sit in my top right are procurement, because a huge amount of the impact is in your scope 3 emissions. So becoming best friends with procurement is really, really important. Another department who I've always became best friends with is comms and marketing. Yeah, driving that engagement internally and externally is really, really crucial. And then for yourselves, I thought about it would be crucial for your operational teams. You might have engineering and maintenance teams as well. These guys are going to be the guys and girls are going to be the eyes and ears of helping deliver this. So they're just a flavour of some of the stakeholders, but it's really important you do that, because to drive this, you need help. So I now wanted to talk to you a little bit about where are you now. So establishing that baseline is crucial, because it's all about how do you know if you're actually getting any better unless you have an accurate baseline, an accurate quantitative baseline. So I wanted to share some information from a piece of work that my team have just done, which is all about scope 1, 2 and 3. So this is CEF's carbon footprint for FY 22-23. Now, obviously the first thing that jumps out at you is, wow, scope 3 is nearly everything. So what that tells us is that all the things that we have direct operational control over is this little sliver here, because over 99% of it sits with suppliers, sits with products, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. Now, for yourselves, I don't know what your mix would be for the Housing Association, but I imagine the majority will be scope 3. So I want to share some of the principles that I think will help you as part of this as well. And when I was in the supermarket sector, it was very similar. Huge amount of scope 3, so that's when I talk about the stakeholder mapping, internally and externally, is crucial. So if we now step into scope 3, I wanted to just give you a flavour of CEF's scope 3 footprint, because again, I think there might be some learning there. So we've got loads and loads of different emissions categories for scope 3. And for us, the big ones are the purchased goods and services. So that's all the products that we buy, either to sell or all the services that we consume, or the products that we consume. Yeah. So tables, chairs, company cars, etc. So for us, you can see the vast majority of that sits in these two categories. Now, unless we had done this piece of work, our scope on our net zero and our decarbonisation strategy would not be worth much, because we could be looking at these different things and thinking, well, this is important, or this is big, or that feels big. Now we know exactly where we need to target our efforts. Yeah, and the same goes for yourselves. Do the scope 3 mapping so you know exactly where you need to target your efforts. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy or simple, it's definitely not, but it means you're not wasting your time. So I now wanted to talk a little bit about, okay, once you've set your scope 1, 2 and 3 baseline, it's, well, where do you want to get to? What's your ambition? And what's your target? So for the housing sector, clearly very closely aligned with government. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a number of government targets, which I think for yourselves are really applicable. So the first one is a 68% reduction in carbon emissions by 2035, ahead of achieving net zero by 2050. So in simple terms, you could say that is the carbon reduction targets for the housing associations and the housing sector. You may want to go further than this. So at CEF, we've set a target to be net zero by 2040, partly because we want to be leaders in our sector, partly because for us it's about walking the talk. We're a big renewables provider, so this is really important for us to deliver this, and plus we've been not pressurised, we've been asked by customers as well to drive this. So a lot of this actually may be driven from your own stakeholders. Okay, so that's where you want to get to. The big question is how. That's loads of context, but actually, what do you need to do? What are the steps you need to take to deliver this? So the first thing is that, hopefully I've emphasised this enough, you need to calculate your carbon footprint, scopes 1, 2 and 3, and getting a good accurate measure of that. Now, bear in mind that your scope 3 footprint will be hugely estimated, but that's okay. It's better to have an accurate score than having no score at all. So that will be an estimate, but over time it will become more and more accurate as you get better and as data becomes better as well. The next thing you need to do is identify decarbonisation opportunities. So how are we actually going to reduce our carbon emissions? And I've got a slide next just to give what I think for the housing sector are really the big ticket items to focus on. The next part is about, okay, how do we model this emissions reduction pathways? And it can get very, very technical. But effectively, if you know where you need to get to, net zero by 2050, once you've worked out your footprint, then effectively you're going to have that step down year on year. Let's say it's a 5 or 6% reduction year on year to get to that net zero. Now, the reality is it will probably be easier at the start because you'll have some quick wins, and then it might get more difficult over time, but then you're relying on things like technology and innovation to drive things forward. One of the first things that I did at CEF was hold a net zero workshop, and this was with the CEO and members of the senior leadership team, department head, to get that buy-in. So it's really, really important, because then you start co-creating the strategy, yeah, and that's really important. You create it in collaboration with your stakeholders. To then develop the roadmap, and this is important. The roadmap within CEF doesn't all sit with my team and I, it sits with various departments who contribute to it. So procurement being one, fleet being another. Yeah, getting that accountability from the start is really important. Then is when you start to implement these actions. Now, making this all seem really simple and straightforward, I know it's not. Yeah, I could stand here for 4 hours going into this in detail, but yeah, I don't think it's probably the best use of your time. But it's just to give you some high level steps and steer of what I think will work for you. And then the final one is around reporting and data. So I spoke earlier about a crucial part of this has been about people and engagement, which it absolutely is. That's closely followed by data. Yeah, having the right level of data that allows you to make the right decisions, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. Because that's also important for accountability. Because if you've got targets by different departments or different regions, that drives action. Yeah, a bit of carrot, a bit of stick. So what I wanted to do was also just share some of what I think are the big ticket items for the housing association and the housing sector. Again, it comes from this wonderful document here. So sort of 2 key areas. First one is fabric first. The fabric of the properties are absolutely fundamental to decarbonisation. Again, you guys will probably know more about this than I do from a fuel poverty perspective, for example, which is absolutely fundamental. So focusing on the fabric first. And parallel with that, my advice would be is look at the power and energy generation. So looking at how are you generating the heat for the properties, and looking at clean heat, renewable generation. And then once you've done that piece, it's rolling out clean heat. So they're the sort of key big ticket items for decarbonisation in the housing sector. Okay, I'm just going to start wrapping things up, and I just wanted to sort of leave you with, for me, I think one of the reasons why I'm standing here today is because I've managed to do this fairly effectively. I've made loads and loads of mistakes over the last 20 years, and I'll continue to make mistakes. But this is something where I think it's something I've been able to do, probably through trial and error. So when I was designing these, I was thinking, well, what mistakes have I made, what's worked, what hasn't worked so well in the past. So this is just really my observations of how you build it into and keep it a priority. And I've deliberately represented it as a circle because it never stops. You have to continually doing this. You have to keep this part of the business operation as a continual process. So the first thing to do, again, I think I've touched on it already a little bit, is people. Yeah, people. It is absolutely crucial to everything you do when it comes to decarbonisation and sustainability. So this is a really important first step, and use that stakeholder mapping that I mentioned earlier, engaging with those stakeholders. Who are the key players? Yeah. Who are the people you need to build those relationships with? And it's really important to take the time to understand their agenda. So part of what I've learned over my career is when I first meet new people within my organisation, I spend lots and lots of time getting to know them, understanding who they are, what makes them tick, what are their priorities, what football team do they support, all these kind of things that allow me to then connect with that person. Whatever's relevant to you, but getting to know people, because that is how you drive change. And what I would say as well is that builds empathy on both sides. And one of the things that I've done as well is that as I've got older, as I've got more confident, but I'm still not afraid to be vulnerable and tell my colleagues and people in my business, I'm struggling, I need your help. Can you help me with X, Y, and Z? So that vulnerability, I think, is really important. It just helps you get that. Also helps you get that buy-in. The next one is the strategy. So in conjunction with your stakeholders, it's then developing, setting and agreeing the strategy, but it's important to agree commitments, goals and metrics. And these are not your commitments, goals and metrics, these are the commitments, goals and metrics of the stakeholders. You might be coordinating it and pulling it all together, but this is about accountability. Everything can't sit with you. You cannot be responsible for all of this because it just won't work. The next one is governance. So this is really, really important. One of the first things I did at CEF was establish a steering group. And it's our CEO who chairs that steering group. So we have that steering group 3 times a year. As I said, it's made up of departments across the business. And what we've done off the back of that is developed a number of different subgroups who have their each roles and responsibilities, who then feed this back up to the steering group, and it's them that talk about what have they made, what steps have they made forward. One of the things that we've committed to as a business is B Corp. So again, the delivery of B Corp within our business is dependent on the people team, the procurement team, the finance team, the marketing and communications team. They have all their own targets and responsibilities, so setting the governance around that and the processes. And as I said, using best practice frameworks as well, so that provides a really strong handrail to what you're doing. Yeah, so things like CDP, for example, and it will make sure that you can optimise your areas as well. Then the next one that's very closely linked to governance is reporting. So data and reporting is crucial. That helps you measure performance, it helps you identify opportunities, but crucially it provides the insights into your objectives, targets and programmes as well. And ultimately, this will help you make informed decisions. It will help you, where do you deploy your resources, where do you focus your efforts? And it also crucially provides the substance for comms and marketing. Yeah, so that is about engaging internally first and foremost. Make sure your internal people know about the strategy, the role they play, and the contribution that they can have to making an impact. Because if you have you could have the world's best, most polished policy strategy document, but unless the people who are delivering this across your entire organisation understand their role, then it's a piece of paper, and that's all it is. Yeah, so it goes back to the top there in terms of stakeholders. And then also, the comms and market helps you build credibility, it helps you build transparency, openness, trust, especially if you are using B Corp or EcoVadis or any of these types of standards to help give that third-party assurance to what you do. And the other part with this that I think is probably going to be really important for you is tenant engagement. Engagement with the tenants in the properties. Telling them about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the roles that they can play, and how you're trying to help them reduce their bills and reduce their carbon emissions. There's one missing here, which is the middle, which I think sort of stitches all of this together, which says that for this to happen, if possible, link it to your company purpose, link it to your organisational purpose, because that then builds it into the company's DNA. It'll stitch it into the fabric of what you do. It'll help you build it into core metrics and core business performance, because if it's part of that, then it should happen. So if you have an existing purpose, let's say that's already in place, so in my experience you can usually find a direct or indirect link to show how ESG, to show how decarbonisation contributes to that company purpose. So I'd pursue that, get your foot in the door and build from there. The flip side is if your organisation is developing its purpose, then get a seat at the table. Use the stakeholders that you've already identified to influence the company purpose. So this becomes part of it, has to become part of it, because it becomes then a no-brainer for what you do. And you think about all organisational purposes, it's very closely aligned to ESG, to decarbonisation. Because if you do that, one of the things that we're rolling out within CEF, or we will be in time, we have just launched our company purpose and we'll get goals and values. But this then will eventually become part of things like job descriptions. It'll become part of performance review. It'll hopefully become part of, for some organisations, become part of remuneration, yeah, pay, benefits, all those kind of things. So that's how you really drive action, driving into that company purpose. So I'm just finishing up now with a few key takeaways. So the first one is understand the status quo. Where are you now? Yeah. What are the foundations that you're going to build your decarbonisation strategy? So you need to understand what that landscape looks like, both quantitative and also qualitative. The next thing is set the strategy, but it has to be done in concert and in unison with the stakeholders across the business, from all parts of the business. It has to happen in collaboration. And then finally, keep it as a core business priority through the governance tips and steps that I shared with you. And if you can, integrate it into your company purpose. That's how it really becomes part of who you are and what you do. And that is it.
Connor, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a few more moments. If you've got any questions, just raise your hand.
Hi, Georgina Patel. Thanks, Connor, for a really useful presentation. I know within your strategic document there's a setting of context. You know, why are we doing this in the first place? Why is it important? But do you think there's a bigger role for education within an organisation to embed a culture of reducing carbon and sustainability?
Yeah, and I have. The short answer is yes, absolutely. But I think that the potential to do that is a lot of the time untapped, because I think that the role of training, and I'll give you an example, we work very closely with our sort of people team, and what we're doing is we're building it into things like the induction and training programs. So when we have new starters, this is part of their induction process. It's part of the first 90 days, but it's also making it part of the ongoing training and engagement and upskilling that people have within organisations. So the training element to this is absolutely crucial.
I'm very much involved with carbon literacy with organisations, and I advise everyone to have a look at carbon literacy project around climate education.
Oh, maybe we could connect, yeah.
Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Hi, Connor. My name is Kemi. I work with Together Housing, and we're creating a framework and toolkit to successfully deliver a decarbonisation project. But my question goes to the beginning now. What do I tell my resident who says, I don't have carbon emissions, when you compare my carbon emissions to transportation or what, the image you showed earlier? What do I tell that resident?
Yeah, good question. Did I say at the start I wasn't an expert in the housing sector? I'm joking. Well, I guess it would be understanding what is important to them. So if it's your resident and you're saying to them, okay, carbon emissions is not important to them, they're a tiny part of it, but I imagine their fuel costs are important to them, their bills, their energy costs are important to them. So when you look at the effect that they can have, I spoke earlier about engagement with people and actually the role that they can play, and I think I put a stat up from the MHF which was around 20% of the emission reductions can actually come through the residents in your case. So I would always try and find a link that says, well, what is important to them, and if it's energy costs or their fuel costs, then I would say, well, if you help us reduce your carbon emissions, yeah, or you would say to them, forget about carbon emissions. Do you want to reduce your energy costs? Do you want to reduce your monthly bills? Well, do X, Y, and Z. Yeah, that could be thinking about reducing how they're using or consuming their energy in the house. So that might not even mention carbon emissions. But the byproducts of that, as I said earlier on, was if you focus on it from a financial perspective or whatever the lever is for that person, that generally drives change, and actually the resultant is that you actually get a reduction in carbon emissions along the way. So that's about as close as I can get, I'm afraid, without really sort of understanding it. But that's what I would say, is find what is important to them, and that goes across everything I've spoken about today. Whoever the stakeholder is, whoever the customer is, spend time finding what's important to them, and generally you can find a link.
Hey Connor, thanks for what was an excellent talk, excellent presentation. I'm the chairman of a group of companies called the Gusto Group. We're house builders. We've been building low energy homes for a long period of time, and we got our B Corp certification 6 months ago, and it's a very painful process, and especially in the sectors that we operate in, because if you look at B Corps, they tend to be in nice, fluffy, nice sectors, and so it's very challenging. How much are you planning to align your supply chain? So we've found that since we've become B Corp certified, my focus now is, can I now find suppliers that are also B Corp certified so we can align our supply chains? Because actually that helps you so much in terms of scope 3, because then you've got confidence that people in your supply chain are actually driving behind the same purpose that you're driving behind. So firstly, congratulations, I think it's brilliant.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on your B Corp certification. So I think I touched on it earlier. If we use carbon emissions as the example, our biggest impact as a business is our supply chain by far. For that pie chart I showed on carbon emissions, you could apply that to ethics, human rights, all these different big chunky, really important topics. So for us, a big part of what we do, and part of what, so I've got head of sustainable supply chain, and her sole focus is driving sustainability in the supply chain. Our focus up to the last 12 months has been on EcoVadis and using that as a platform to drive that sustainability, because that's very complementary to B Corp. And B Corp will come in terms of, once we're B Corp certified, then our expectations will in time be about, okay, well, let's get on this journey with us in terms of our suppliers, and we're already starting to see that. We're starting to target more of our supplier spend on EcoVadis, which is a step to B Corp. Now, from the EcoVadis perspective, we are actually building that into the commercial agreements now, and we're saying, you've got a couple of years, guys, to get on a journey with us. Time's running out. Unless you start to get on this sustainability journey and really commit to it, then we're going to have to have serious conversations about the future of that. So that to us is the first step. That will then lend its way, I think, to B Corp. But B Corp is a big commitment, as you know, and it's quite complex. So for us, I think we'll be having that conversation as well that says, learn from us, we can help, we can support you through that. But I think the general direction of travel is that a lot of what we do is actually driven by what our customers are demanding. So our big blue chip customers, they're starting to say, well, from a supply chain ethics perspective, you need X, Y, and Z. So there's a real commercial driver and risk to this as well. So will we ever demand that all our suppliers are B Corp certified? It won't happen within the next 5 years. That's just not realistic. But from an EcoVadis perspective, which is probably not as stringent, but it's complementary to B Corp, yes, we are targeting about 80% of our suppliers by the end of this calendar year will be EcoVadis, which means that they have started that sustainability journey. But supply chain is massively important for us, and thankfully I report into the group commercial director, and supply chain sits under him, so he's a big advocate of driving us in the supply chain as well. So, but yeah, it's magic. Thank you.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? We'll wrap that up. Connor, thank you very much. That was brilliant.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers, guys.